Characteristics of life. This is one of my favorite topics to discuss in biology because essentially biology being the study of life, this is the study of what is foundational to biology. And a fun place, an appropriate place to start as we talk about the characteristics that all living things share is where our evolution of understanding on this topic has come from. And there was once this way of thinking. It's called spontaneous generation, which basically said that life comes from non-living things. And so people of the day would do things like this. There was actually a book that had a recipe in it for how to make flies, which of course everyone wants to know the answer to that question, right? So what the book suggested was that in order to make flies, you would follow this recipe. You take a glass jar, you put a piece of meat in it, and then you leave it for a few days. And then once you have taken the lid off, you have flies. And so this seemed to work, but it wasn't until this guy named Redi, who was an Italian physician, naturalist, and poet, and his time frame was about the mid to late 1600s. He was the first to challenge this idea of spontaneous generation, and he said, wait a minute, it's not really the meat or this recipe of different non-living things that you've put together that is creating the flies. It's the fact that flies come from eggs, and eggs come from other living things, which were the previous flies. So in other words, life comes from life. Living things come from other living things. And this is a contrasting view from spontaneous generation that is called biogenesis. Life comes from life. When we think of living things, we tend to often think about things that look a little bit more like ourselves. For example, animals. And we'll talk this year about the characteristics of animals. Cephalization is one of them, which is that animals tend to have a head with maybe a face that we can relate to, and we see that as, okay, that's a living thing. But when you go out to play baseball in the grass, next time you see a mushroom, think of that as that's a living thing. In fact, the grass under you is a living thing. That mold on your bread that looks so disgusting when you pull out the bread that you forgot about in the back of the pantry or whatever, that is a living thing worthy of study and respect as well. So there are 8 things that scientists agree upon that every single living thing, ranging from those things that we can relate to a little bit more to those things that we maybe don't recognize so much as life, but nevertheless definitely is, all of those things share 8 characteristics. So the first thing we need to do, though, is define what is a non-living thing. And this is pretty obvious. There's 2 groups of these things. The first type of non-living thing is things that were never part of a living thing. Okay, so geological entities, stones would be an example of that. Gold is an element that you find on the periodic table, and it is naturally occurring on our planet, and it was never part of a living thing. The other category of non-living things are things that were once part of a living thing. So, for example, the coal that your dad may have used to start the grill this summer, that was once the carbon that made up bodies of living things. It's gone through a lot of different changes over a long period of time. Paper, obviously once part of a tree. Jam, the strawberries or the blueberries or whatever to make that up was once part of a living thing, and that's the second category of non-living. Now, what is a living thing? And the definition of that is any organism that has or can develop the ability to act or function independently. So there's this big emphasis on independent existence. And you see some examples here, one of which, the cheetah, which can run up to 65, 70 miles per hour. And then these are bacterial cells, which are tiny, microscopic, and nevertheless share all the characteristics of all living things. So the first characteristic of a living thing is they are made up of cells. And a cell is a collection of living matter that's enclosed by a barrier. That means that there is a difference between the inside of that cell and the outside of that cell, its surroundings. And these are the smallest units that can be considered alive. Now, this can range from a multicellular individual like you, which is made of trillions of cells, or a unicellular organism like this paramecium. It's a type of protist, which is a kingdom taxonomic classification we'll talk about later. Basically, these guys live in things like pond water and eat other really small things like bacteria and make their living that way. But this would be what maybe your epithelial cells, your skin cells would look like in your body if we looked at them under a microscope. And so you're a collection of lots of different cells. Nevertheless, you are made up of cells. Now, the second thing is that all living things reproduce. When you think about it, this is pretty much a necessity for life to continue. And this can be in the form of several different types of reproduction. So the first type is what we maybe don't think about so much. This is asexual reproduction. And this is when a single parent reproduces by itself. There are some fascinating different ways of going about this, which we'll study this year. But this organism is actually undergoing budding, which is where its offspring is just growing off its own body. Can you imagine if we reproduce that way? Contrastingly, humans and many other animals and plants will reproduce through sexual reproduction. And this is going to introduce different genes into a mix of a new individual, and that's very important. The third characteristic is that living things have a genetic code, and for living things on Earth, that genetic code is DNA. And so the genetic code of DNA determines the inherited traits of every organism on Earth, down from that small bacterial cell which is living in your intestines, which, by the way, you are actually dependent upon for help in metabolizing your food, all the way ranging to your mother. Every one of those living things is based on deoxyribonucleic acid to store the information to be able to build the body of that organism. Fourth characteristic of a living thing is that they grow and they develop. And I love these photos because this is my daughter Mabin, and this is a newborn photo that was taken of her. Incidentally, living thing, non-living thing, which also has cephalization, by the way, but nevertheless non-living. But this photo shows that she was a very small size when she was born, 6 pounds, 14 ounces, and she did a lot of eating and sleeping when she was this age. Now, this is a photo that was taken the day that this screencast is being made, which is in 2014, and at this point of production, Mabin is 13 months, and she is sitting by herself wearing sunglasses that she put on her face and recognizing herself in the mirror. And that, students, is called development. And that is her ability to develop maybe mentally, physically. The growth aspect is just the increase in size that you see from here to here. And she's still a little girl, but she has increased in size some. And you see the same with this little baby elephant and the mother. So characteristic number 5. Organisms have to have an ability to maintain, to obtain materials and use them for energy. In other words, they got to be able to take in food, or at least sunlight to produce that food in the case of photosynthesizers, or to take in decomposing organisms, matter, and make energy of that. But they've got to be able to obtain and use materials for energy. This gets into a word called metabolism, and you need to know this word. It is a conglomeration of lots of chemical reactions that happen in the body of an organism to be able to either build or break down materials to use as energy, and that's metabolism. Characteristic number 6 is response to the environment. Now, some of you may be sitting in here today and you think, why is it so cold in Mrs. Miller's classroom or at home, wherever you're watching the screencast? And you may even have chill bumps. And chill bumps are basically little muscles, they're called erector pili muscles in your skin that will raise up the little hairs on your body, trying to envelop you in a cushion of air to try to keep you warm. That's one response to your environment. You may also respond to things like light or touch, to heat, or to sound. And so living things are able to respond to their environment. Now you may think, how does a bacterial cell respond to its environment. I mean, come on. Well, there is documented evidence of certain motile or moving bacterial cells. They use a little flagella, which is like a little tail, and they can actually sense the presence of light in some cases, or the presence of food particles that are placed in a medium in which they're moving, and they can actually sense that and even move toward it. And that's an example of response to an environment. Characteristic number 7 of 8, we're almost there, is maintaining a stable internal environment. All right, think about how bad you feel when you're sick and you have a fever. Your internal environment has now shifted from its norm, and you have a very artistic way even of maintaining that, let's say 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit within your body, along with certain salt and water balances that need to happen. You need very specific types of scenarios for you to be able to survive. So homeostasis is another buzzword that you need to know, which is the process by which organisms keep their internal conditions relatively stable. So the example that you see here is this hiker is caught in a storm, temperatures decrease, and you can actually see here how the receptors in her skin are transmitting a message to her brain, which is then affecting those shivering muscles, similar to the ones that I was just talking about with the hairs, and that actually causes her to then shiver, which helps to generate heat, maybe keeping her warm. That's one example of homeostasis in the body. Lastly, characteristic number 8. All living things change over time. Now, when you think about this word change over time, maybe it brings to mind another buzzword in biology, which is the word evolution. And we're going to unpack this much more this year. But basically, you're looking at changes that may not be significant in the first few generations, but over enough time, we may see big changes. Did you know that fossil evidence, as well as other types of evidence, suggest that the modern day whale has actually evolved from a 4-legged terrestrial or land-dwelling organism? And we'll study this later too. But look at this ancestral organism that then fossil evidence shows an evolution toward this. Now, key point. Does it happen in one individual during one lifetime? Absolutely not. You do not evolve in the biological genetic sense during your lifetime. But over enough time and enough many generations, for humans especially, for other organisms that reproduce really quickly, maybe bacteria, it can happen quicker, but this change in allele or gene frequencies over time, which code for your characteristics, is called evolution. And so all living things do evolve. So, a recap, and feel free to pause if you're watching this screencast on your own, but the characteristics of living things: all things are made up of cells. All things reproduce, whether asexually or sexually. All things are based on a universal genetic code, deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA, baby. All things grow, they get bigger, they develop, they change into maybe more intricate mental and physical abilities. They metabolize, in other words, obtain and use materials and energy. They respond to their environment and different stimuli. They maintain a stable internal environment. What was that word? Homeostasis. And lastly, they change over time, given enough time and enough generations, and that is the word evolution. Hey, congratulations on being part of our planet's myriad of living things. You, my friend, share all 8 characteristics.